G'day, you wordsmith wizard. Today, we're not just donning any old hats. We're diving into the wild world of the writing concisely hat, where every word counts more than your Wi-Fi password. Then we'll strut our stuff into the realm of the structure hat. Because, let's face it, your masterpiece should be as organized as your gaming setup. And last, but definitely not least, we're getting fancy with the imagery, punctuation, and paragraphing hat, where we'll make content pop like the latest meme. So grab those metaphorical hats, or in this case, literal hats, and let's whip those speeches, posts, and stories into shape because, trust me, these hats are cooler than sunglasses in a thunderstorm.
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
Welcome to the second last lesson in Module 5 and the last video lesson in Module 5. By this stage, you've either watched all the previous lessons in this module or 2/3 of them, depending on whether you chose option A or option B way back in the very first lesson in this module. Regardless of which option you chose, you should be super proud of yourself for making it to this point. I know this module has been long. Trust me, I felt that as I was creating. But now that you're so close to the end of it, hopefully you think the effort's been worth it. If you don't think so yet, just wait until you complete a full composing section under time conditions. You'll see. Anyway, as we can see, we're talking about reviewing persuasive texts, imaginative texts, and interpretive texts. In saying that, there is no point continuing with this lesson if you haven't watched and completed the activities in relation to all the previous lessons, or at least 2/3 of them if you chose option B. In other words, there is no point watching this lesson on how to review your responses if you have not written any responses yet. On the topic of who chose option B, if you did, feel free to skip the part of this lesson for the text type that you didn't study. One final thing I want to reiterate before we get started is this. I don't expect you to be able to review your responses as we're going to in this lesson in your exam. I understand what the realities of time conditions are. They suck. Adding more to your plate beyond what's actually in the exam paper is a waste of time and will cause unnecessary stress. I don't want that for you. Hence, this lesson is how to review your practice responses so you can give yourself feedback, improve incrementally, and peak in the exam. So let's work our way to that peak one slide at a time, starting with lesson objectives. As is conventional for a review lesson at the end of a module, we're going to reiterate why it's so essential for you to review your practice responses. From there, I will explain the guiding principles for reviewing text types. First subsection will be a recap of the writing concisely principle. Then we'll discuss a new one. It's the imagery, punctuation, and paragraphing principle. That is a tongue twister. Finally, we'll discuss the structure principle. Much easier. Once we've done that, we'll turn to reviewing example 1 from the lessons on persuasive texts. In relation to this text type, we'll illustrate how to apply the writing concisely principle. We'll illustrate how to apply the structure principle. We'll highlight one overarching point of feedback. We'll do a very similar thing for interpretive texts, illustrate how to apply the writing concisely principle, illustrate how to apply the structure principle, and highlight one overarching point of feedback. Slightly different for imaginative texts, we will review example 2, illustrate how to apply the imagery, punctuation, and paragraphing principle, illustrate how to apply the structure principle, highlight one overarching point of feedback. Finally, we've got a hot date with a simple summary. Let's rewind, have a quick chat about why it's so essential for you to review your practice responses. I'll just cut straight to the chase. It's going to improve your exam performance. You might recall this analogy that we discussed in Module 3. Failing to review your practice responses is like baking cookies and not eating any. It is a waste. What's the meaning behind this? How is reviewing practice responses analogous to eating cookies? You might be surprised to hear there are more similarities than you would have initially thought. The first thing you do when you go and write a response is you plan that response. Similarly, when you're going to bake cookies, you will gather and mix the ingredients. Back to this side, once you plan the response, you'll write it. Over on the cookies side, once you gather the ingredients, you will bake the cookies. Coming back to our response side, once you write it, you'll review it. Once you bake the cookies, you will eat the cookies. Over on the writing side, once you review your response, you'll improve the quality of your writing. Once you eat the cookies, you'll satisfy your craving for cookies. Once you improve the quality of your writing, your English ATAR mark will go up. Once you satisfy your craving, you will live your best life. All of this is to say, reviewing your practice responses is a prerequisite for increasing your English ATAR mark, just like eating cookies is a prerequisite for living your best life. I want to let the record show I am not saying reviewing your practice responses is as satisfying as eating cookies. I might be a nerd, but that would be blasphemy. I am saying that writing a practice response and not reviewing it is like baking cookies and letting them go to waste. Don't let that happen. Thank you for indulging me on that recap of why it's so important to review responses. Now let's look at the guiding principles for reviewing text types. In Module 3 and 4, we learned that the guiding principle for reviewing a practice response is writing concisely. For composing section questions, the writing concisely principle is just one review principle of 3 in total that we use for the different text types. This table illustrates what I mean by this. For persuasive text, the relevant review principles are firstly, writing concisely, and then secondly, structure. For interpretive text, we've got writing concisely principle, and would you look at that? Structure. However, we've got a slight deviation for imaginative text. First review principle is the mouthful, imagery, punctuation, and paragraphing principle. Second principle is structure. Let's do a little recap of the writing concisely principle first. What exactly does the writing concisely principle mean? Here's a recap of the definition. It means addressing each part of the question in a few words and with no ambiguity. We can understand the writing concisely principle by breaking down this definition into its key elements. The first element of the definition is comprehensiveness, and that refers to addressing each part of the question. The next element of the definition is brevity, and that refers to the a few words part of the definition. The third and final element of the definition is clarity, which refers to not being ambiguous. So comprehensiveness, brevity, clarity, these are the elements that help you make your writing concise. But how can we turn those elements into actionable things that can help us write better responses? Well, let's rewind, go back to comprehensiveness, which means addressing each part of the question. Your response will be comprehensive if you properly plan using the planning steps for the relevant text type, and then incorporate that information in your response. Sweet. That is comprehensiveness covered. The other 2 elements are brevity and clarity. To ensure your response is both brief and clear, ask yourself the following questions. Does this sentence, phrase, or word add value to my response? This question is getting at the brevity element of the writing concisely definition. By the way, adding value to your response means writing something that relates to the question and your thesis / a main idea. So, does this sentence, phrase, or word add value to my response? If it doesn't, delete it. But if it does, ask yourself the following question. Can I write this sentence, phrase, or word more clearly? And this refers to the clarity element. If you can, rewrite it. If you can't, leave it. These 2 elements of writing concisely, brevity and clarity, are going to inform the way we review our persuasive and interpretive texts. That's a recap of the writing concisely principle. Let's move to the next one. It is the imagery, punctuation, and paragraphing principle. The application of this mouthful of a principle is imaginative texts. In light of this, note the following. This principle, the IPP principle, how did I not pick up on that earlier? For imaginative text is the equivalent of the writing concisely principle for persuasive and interpretive texts. Just think of that as the only main distinction between the application of these review principles to the different text types. To help you really cement that understanding, it's useful to understand why we're not applying the writing concisely principle to imaginative texts. The why is this. Writing concisely isn't necessarily something we want to aim for in our imaginative creative writing. Why? Well, let's return to my short story titled Simon Says as an example. That story was written with a person central narrative POV, and the type of narrator was unreliable, mainly because the protagonist was prepubescent and therefore naive. You wouldn't expect a naive, prepubescent boy to narrate concisely. If anything, you'd expect the exact opposite. So that really highlights why writing concisely isn't a priority, but what's so important about imagery, punctuation, and paragraphing in particular. Basically, because they are often and easily neglected by amateur story writers such as you and me. On that note, let's check out the definition for this principle. This principle means ensuring your short story employs imagery, proper punctuation, and appropriate paragraphing. Let's break this definition up into its key elements. Element 1 is imagery. Element 2, proper punctuation. Element 3, appropriate paragraphing. If you haven't figured it out yet, these elements represent the most important miscellaneous tips and tricks that were referred to in the lesson titled How to Structure Your Response to an Imaginative Composing Section Question. Here's the relevant discussion about these 3 elements from that structure lesson. Let's take a look at each one of these 6 miscellaneous tips and tricks, starting with language. No, I can't do it. Fixed. First tip that relates to this point is show, don't tell by using imagery. This is an example of showing instead of simply telling. Short, matte, black hair, big eyes the way they are in Japanese animation, skin milk thin, buttermilk sallow in her dress, with a wallpaper pattern of dark roses. This woman was also in my tuberculosis support group Friday night. She was in my melanoma round table Wednesday night. Monday night, she was in my firm believers leukemia rap group. The part down the center of her hair is a crooked lightning bolt of white scalp. That is an excerpt from Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk. There it is. Here, Palahniuk has used visual imagery to show what this character looks like instead of simply tell. So, an example of what to do, here is an example of telling what not to do. Short, black hair, big eyes, and pale skin in her dress. This woman was also in my tuberculosis support group Friday night. She has a part down the center of her hair. Compare the sort of imagery you get of this character once you read the telling version and once you read the showing version, the original version. Before we move to the next tip regarding language, remember that visual imagery is just one type of imagery. There are 5 in total, and all 5 are, you guessed it, in the LFB. Our third bunch of tips and tricks relate to punctuation, everyone's favorite topic. Tip number 1, keep dialogue punctuation inside quotation marks. Examples of when the punctuation is inside the quotation marks, which is what we're going for. 106, Simon asks. This is a question. It's calling out for 106 within dialogue. So because it's a question, we use a question mark, and because it's within dialogue, we're making sure that the punctuation is inside the quotation marks. This is an example of when the punctuation is outside the quotation mark. This is what we don't want to do. 106, and the question mark is after the quotation mark. No deal. Tip number 2 is use ellipses to indicate that a character's words are trailing off. Example, I suppose we could... She hesitated. This character's words are trailing off as indicated through the use of these 3 dots and ellipsis. Tip number 3 is use dashes to indicate that a character's words are being cut off. Example, I wish, shut up, Liz interrupted. The dash is being used to indicate that Liz has interrupted this person, or that Liz has cut off this person. Tip number 4, use commas to punctuate dialogue tags. What are dialogue tags? I'm so glad you asked. He said, she asked, they inquired. Dialogue tags are used by an author to tell the reader that a person within the text has said something. These are just 3 examples of dialogue tags, but there are heaps. So our point with tip number 4 is you should use commas to punctuate dialogue tags. We know what dialogue tags are. What does this tip mean? Here's an example. The waitress called out, "Madam, you left your jacket." So in this example, we have the dialogue tag, the waitress called out, and it's punctuating a piece of dialogue. It's separating the tag from the dialogue. Here's another example. Well, if you told me, Jasper mumbled, we could have hashed it out. In this example, we have 2 commas. We've got 2 commas because the dialogue tag, Jasper mumbled, is in the middle of dialogue. The 2 commas are punctuating a gap between the first chunk of dialogue and the second chunk of dialogue. with the dialogue tag coming in between them. Last example, we should get out of here, he whispered. The dialogue tag is he whispered, the dialogue is we should get out of here. In this final example, a comma is being used to punctuate, separate the dialogue from the dialogue tag. As is often the case, we've got a couple exceptions. Don't use commas to punctuate dialogue tags that come after dialogue that trails off, in which case use an ellipsis, such as, I suppose we could, she hesitated. Notice here there is no comma to punctuate the dialogue from the dialogue tag. Another exception is when the dialogue is exclamatory, in which case use an exclamation mark. Example of an exclamatory sentence is shut up. Notice how the exclamation mark is being used here instead of a comma. To punctuate the dialogue tag, Liz interrupted. Last exception for using commas to punctuate dialogue tags is when you have some dialogue that is interrogative, one of those ones. For this sort of dialogue, use a question mark. An interrogative piece of text is like it's interrogating something, it's asking a question, hence the use of a question mark. For example, 106, Simon says. Here, because this is an interrogative piece of dialogue, we have used a question mark to punctuate the dialogue tag Simon asks, instead of a comma. Those are our 3 exceptions to using commas to punctuate dialogue tags. One note regarding dialogue tags. Use them sparingly. If it's clear who's speaking, it's not necessary to use a dialogue tag. Bear that in mind whenever you're thinking about using one. If you are in the reader's shoes, would I understand who is saying this segment of dialogue right now? If not, put a dialogue tag in there. If yes, don't bother with one. Let's keep this punctuation train chugging along with tip number 5, use full stops to punctuate action tags. Lennox, enough with all these tags. What the fuck is an action tag? I am so glad you asked. Couple of examples. He nodded in agreement. She gestured at the door. They extended their hand. A dialogue tag indicates when some dialogue has been spoken. An action tag indicates when an action has been done. Those are action tags. Here are examples of this 5th tip of using full stops to punctuate them. It's over here. Jeremy pointed to the shelf. As we can see, we've got the 1 full stop to punctuate the dialogue over here with the action tag over here. Example number 2, he shook his head. It's not the same. The action tag is here and a full stop is used to punctuate it or create a gap between it and the dialogue. Like with dialogue tags, exceptions exist, and the main one for action tags is use a comma when using an action and a dialogue tag. Kat shook her head. This is an action tag. And said, this is a dialogue tag. It's the best we've got. Tip number 6 for punctuation, always start a section of dialogue with a capital letter. Examples. Don't be so hurried to decide, Melanie said. You still have plenty of time. This is a pretty stock standard example because we've got the full stop after Melanie said. So we're starting a new sentence and we know that we always have a capital letter when we start a new sentence for the first word. But this example is where we might get tripped up because we've got a comma to punctuate the dialogue tag with the dialogue. Technically, this is an action tag, she leaned in, and whispered is the dialogue tag. And we've got a comma to punctuate it, and the dialogue is, don't forget to lock your door. Because this is a section of dialogue, we are starting it with a capital letter. One more example, you should join us for dinner, he insisted. The section of dialogue is starting with a capital letter. We've got an exception. Use lowercase to continue a section of dialogue interrupted by a dialogue or an action tag. Well, I said, get on with it then. This section of dialogue, well, get on with it then, is separated or punctuated by a dialogue tag, I said. So because this section of dialogue is continuing with the interrupted section, we will use a lowercase instead of a capital letter. Those are all our tips regarding punctuation. Final bunch of tips relate to paragraphing. In fact, there is just one tip. Start a new paragraph or line when you change time or location. Start a new topic or shift speakers. What? No, actually, I understand why. All good. Examples. When her father had made this claim, it had seemed so outlandish, so overblown that it had not assuaged Sophia's distress in the least. But turning in place on the Place de la Concorde, seeing the Arc de Triomphe, and the Eiffel Tower, and the Tuileries, and the cars and Vespers zipping around the great obelisk, Sophia had an inkling of what her father had been trying to say. We then have the start of a new paragraph or line. Was it like this all night? Richard van der Weil, who was standing in his apartment in the embassy, had just noticed the angle of his bow tie in the bedroom mirror. It was at a slant of 25 degrees. This excerpt is from A Gentleman in Moscow, one of my favorite books. Here, a new paragraph has been started because there has been a shift in time. All of a sudden, we have gone from being on the Place de la Concorde to standing in his apartment. Next example, the guard wearing a tight brown uniform and mirrored shades waves the truck through, keeps waving. Neil rolls past, his pulse even, barely elevated. 200 yards on, the Mexican guard gives the F-150 an equally cursory look and motions him past the entry checkpoint. 3 minutes later, Chris radios. That example is from Heat 2, written by Michael Mann and Meg Gardner. Heat is a movie that came out in the 90s, I believe. It's one of the best heist movies of all time. First time Robert De Niro and Al Pacino were seen on screen together. Michael Mann directed that movie. Fast forward 35 years, Michael Mann's like, oh, I'm going to do Heat 2, but I'm not going to create it as a movie. I'm just going to try this writing thing instead. Co-publishes Heat 2 as the sequel to Heat 1, but Heat 2 is a book. Nuts. In this case, we have a change in time. I got these examples mixed up. The first example was a change in location, and this example is a change in time. Because there has been a change in time, we have started a new paragraph. Third example of starting a new line or paragraph when a new topic has been discussed. Nothing but what you might expect. Pink, tumbled boulders with guano laid on them like icing, and a steep slope up to the shattered rocks that crowned the bastion. A sound behind him made him turn. Jack was edging along the ledge. That is from Lord of the Flies. The topic of this first paragraph or first sentence is tumbled boulders. The topic of this second one is a sound behind him. This is an example of starting a new topic from here to here, so we're starting a new paragraph. Our fourth and final example for when we start a new paragraph or line is when we shift speakers. For example, I'm not going with you, Jeff said. Mudith glared. Oh, yes, you are. That's correct. This is incorrect. I'm not going with you, Jeff said. Mudith glared. Oh, yes, you are. Because we are shifting speakers from Jeff to Mudith, we have to start Mudith's speech on a new line. Okay, I know that stuff wasn't necessarily the most interesting, but hopefully you can see why it had to be done. All of that stuff you really need to know in order to write decent short stories. Imagery, proper punctuation, appropriate paragraphing. It's like riding a bike. Let's turn to the final principle. It's the structure principle. Arguably the most important of all three principles, and probably the most straightforward. Its application is to all three text types: persuasive, interpretive, and imaginative. Let's get to know this principle a little bit better by checking out its definition, which is ensuring your text incorporates all the elements of a either persuasive speech, blog post, or short story, taught in English ATAR made simple. What are the elements of this long definition? Element number 1 is the elements of a persuasive speech. Element number 2 is the elements of a blog post. Element number 3, you guessed it, the elements of a short story. But what are those elements? We already know them by this stage. They're the elements of each text type from the lessons on structure that we learned in this module. Here's the title section for each text type. Here's the introduction section, the body paragraphs or middle section, and the conclusion or end section. This is what the whole table looks like. It's in the PDF study notes. I'm going to include a flashback of one of our discussions of the comparison of text type structures from one of the 3 structure lessons in this module. It'll be marked in the chapters below this video, so stick around for the next couple of minutes if you want to have a refresher about these elements and how they're similar and different. If that stuff is still pretty fresh for you, feel free to skip to the next chapter. Starting with the title for each of these 4 text types. Essay doesn't have one. Persuasive speech, it does, and it consists of the title, subtitle, and byline. Blog posts, it does, it is section 0. It consists of the headline, the byline, the comments, and the topics. Final text type is our short stories. It has a title, and that title alludes to a theme or an idea, a character, and or a plot point. Let's take a look at the intro or beginning section of the different text types. An essay has an introduction, and the elements of that introduction are general statement, transition to text, plot synopsis, terminology, body paragraphs, thesis. A persuasive speech also has an introduction. The theme of that introduction is ethos, activate, introduce, contextualize, reasons, thesis. The blog post, it's section 1, the introduction, activate, relevance, outline. And for our short story, we've got the beginning, which consists of the exposition as the main section, the only section, and its elements are characters, setting, and action in no particular order. Then we've got the body paragraphs or middle sections of the text types. For an essay, we've got BP1, it's teal. For a persuasive speech, we've got reason 1, logos is the theme, and tealt are the elements. Blog post, section 2, main idea 1, it uses imaginative language features, it's got a heading. Its subsections are idea, example, explain. For our short story, we've got the first section of the middle part. It's the background. It consists of the trigger element and the conflict element. Still in the middle part of the text types, for an essay, same as BP1, BP2 is a teal paragraph. For a persuasive speech, the next paragraph is reason 2, the theme is logos, elements are tealt. Blog post, section 3, main idea 2, uses persuasive language features. It's got a heading. Elements are idea, example, explain, quote. For our short story, the section is the rising action. The ingredient is the setback. Final section of the middle part or body paragraphs of these text types. For an essay, BP3, teal, structure. For a persuasive speech, it is the counter-argument, reason 3 paragraph. The theme is pathos. The elements are to real. Blog post, we've got section 4, main idea 3, uses a blend of imaginative and persuasive language features. It's got a heading. The elements are idea, examples, explain. Lastly, the short story, the section is the climax and the ingredient is the finale. Finally, final part of all the text types, for an essay, it is the conclusion. We've got thesis, terminology, body paragraphs, general statement. For a persuasive speech, also the conclusion, the theme is kairos. We have thesis, reasons, call to action, general statement. Blog post, section 5, the conclusion, got a heading, elements, summary, call to action. For a short story, we have the resolution as the section and the aftermath as the element. Woohoo! Comparison of text type structures completed. Beautiful work. Oh, yep. That hat hair is here. Well, it's out there now. That was an overview of our 3 review principles that we'll be applying for the rest of this lesson. By the way, the rest of this lesson basically shows you how to complete the activities for this lesson, so pay attention. Let's start off with persuasive texts. Relevant question for persuasive text that we'll be looking at again. I don't think you quite understand the ramifications of this decision. Incorporate this statement into a persuasive text for a resistant audience. Recap of step 5 and step 6 of the planning steps for that question. Pause the video, have a read of it, see you when you're back. So in relation to this example and this question, let's talk about how to apply the writing concisely principle. Remember what this key is all about? We've seen it a few times already. One element of the key is unnecessary repetition, which refers to brevity, will be referred to in red. Instances where we delete text to make our response more briefer, text will be struck through. Where we rearrange the syntax to make our response clearer, we will underline. Chunks of text that will be reworded in the effort to make our response clearer will be emboldened. And any instances where we move sentences around to make the response clearer will be indicated through an arrow. In the reviewed version of the paragraphs we're going to be looking at, edited info will be indicated in purple. This is the original version of body paragraph 2. You may recall it is thick. This is the reviewed version that we're about to take a look at. Pause the video and have a read of each version, which is reproduced in the PDF study notes. Read original version of BP2 first, and then read the reviewed version. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you found that insightful, just looking at the things that I cut out, the things that I changed. All of my main thoughts about going from the original version to the reviewed version are reproduced in the PDF study notes. So for that reason, we'll just discuss some of the main comments that you see in those notes. Starting with an example of deleted text to make the response briefer. If we take Lime Magazine's findings, 3 hours and 48 minutes per day equate to 83,220 minutes on your phone each year, or rada. The sentence above that in the original version of the response said, adolescents aged between 16 to 19 on average spend 3 hours and 48 minutes on social media daily. These sentences that I've struck out merely repeat what I've said in this sentence in a different way. It's repeating something I've already said without adding any sort of value to the response. Delete it. Now let's check out an example of rewording some sentences to make the response clearer. Original version is all of this. Pause the video now and read it for yourself if you can't really remember just by having a quick glance of it, what it's all about. So I turned all of that stuff into this reviewed version. And raise your right hand if you spend less than 2 hours daily on socials, your left hand if you spend less than 3 hours per day, and both hands if you spend less than 4 hours. Thank you so much for participating. You can lower your hands and open your eyes. The original version was too long. The reviewed version conducts the same experiment in half the words. Another example of rewording sentences in the aim to make the response clearer. Original, approximately 5% of you have to spend less than 2 hours on your phone each day, 20% less than 3 hours, 50% less than 4 hours, and 25% less than 5 hours. The reviewed version replaces the numbers for words. Most of the numbers. Here's a vital life writing hack for you to know. If you're writing the number 9 or below, spell out the word. 10 or above, write the number. Major exception to that rule, spell out a number that's at the beginning of a sentence, even if it's higher than 10. Sweet. Here is an example of edited info. The original, by doing this, you'll be freeing up around 100 minutes every single day to do other stuff that's important to you. Reviewed, and that's one example of how a digital boundary, intentionality, can help you reclaim lost time. Adding this sentence onto the reviewed version reinforces my thesis in this response, which is you need digital boundaries. States that intentionality is an example of a digital boundary, and reiterates reason 2, which is lost time. Those are all the comments about that body paragraph in relation to this hat. Here's a feedback point in relation to that discussion. Writing a persuasive speech doesn't give you a license to include superfluous content. Superfluous just means more than enough, and I identified from our discussion of that example that I wasn't writing concisely enough. There were a lot of fluff words in there. So based on my identifying that theme, I've said just don't write this superfluous extra content. Anyway, that's how we can apply the writing concisely principle to persuasive text. Now let's talk about how we can apply the structure principle to persuasive texts. Our task here, should we choose to accept it, it's to cross-reference the structure of a persuasive speech with your color-coded paragraphs to determine whether you've accidentally omitted any elements. Before you think, what on earth does that mean? Here's an example. I go through the following process in applying the structure principle to a color-coded and modified version of the reason 2 body paragraph from example 1. I revise the structure of the reason 2 body paragraph, which is this. Tilt are the elements. As we can see, most of the elements are included in this modified version of body paragraph 2, but one is missing. Obviously, it's the transition. Therefore, step 3 involves annotating the paragraph to include any omitted elements. In this example, I would annotate the paragraph to include the last thing I'd like to address before wrapping up is something I reckon most of you have been thinking about over the past 10 minutes. I realize I forgot to include the transition, so I write one, annotate it to where it should be, and voila, the paragraph is complete. You have applied the structure principle. Some feedback in relation to that exercise. Don't forget to include the transition element in the reason 1 and reason 2 body paragraphs. Mental note. That's our application of both principles. Let's come up with one overarching point of feedback in relation to all of that. Oh yeah, this hat here is getting far worse. We go through this process by firstly looking at our feedback from each review hat. Writing a persuasive speech doesn't give you a license to include superfluous content. For the structure hat, don't forget about the transition element in the reason 1 and reason 2 body paragraphs. So if I wanted to summarize really the essence of what these 2 main points are saying into one point, it could be include a transition sentence in the first 2 body paragraphs and avoid using too many filler words. That's the one thing I'm going to bear in mind after reviewing my persuasive text. Up next, reviewing example 1 from the lessons on interpretive texts. The question, our greatest experiences are our quietest moments. Create an interpretive text in which you reflect on this quotation. The relevant planning steps for this question. Pause the video, have a quick skim, and let's discuss how to apply the writing concisely principle. This is the key that we looked at for persuasive texts. This key is the key we're looking at in relation to the reviewed version of the response. The edited info element, which is indicated in purple, is the same, but we've got this addition of this little icon here, which is used to indicate where I would insert white space. If you can't recall what white space is, here's a little flashback from the relevant lesson. What's white space? It literally just refers to the amount of white space between chunks of text. Got any examples? Here's what a chunk of text looks like with white space. The white space is literally the amount of space between this last sentence and this subheading and this first sentence. This is what this chunk of text looks like without white space. Which version would you rather read? This or this? If you studied interpretive texts, it probably wouldn't come as any surprise to you to learn that we are looking at this paragraph. The main problem with it, also not surprising, it was too wordy, too long. This is what the reviewed version looks like. Pause the video, have a read of both versions. Don't forget to read the original one first and then the reviewed. We can see that the white space does make the reviewed version visually more appealing, which makes it easier for our brains to process. Here are some of the main comments that I wanted to highlight. Firstly, regarding deleted text, which will make our text briefer. I decided to delete these 3 sentences. Why? They don't add any value to my response. The main idea for this paragraph or section was Sweden and preparation. The sentences that I've written here and ultimately decided to delete refer to the part of the main idea, which is Sweden, but have nothing to do with the other part of the main idea, preparation. It's not adding value to your response if it's not advancing your thesis in some way. Another comment relates to rearranging some syntax to make the response clearer. The original version is this. It was approaching dinner time, so I thought I may as well get some food, etc. The reviewed version is as follows. I tried to Google where a nearby restaurant or grocery store was because it was almost dinner time, but I realized I didn't have any Wi-Fi or cellular. Probably trimmed like 10 to 20% off the sentence. It's not much, but if you're able to do that across an entire paragraph, an entire response, that adds up. You're writing better in less time. Winning. Here's an example of edited info. Basically, I added this sentence at the end of this section because the original version didn't achieve its purpose of explaining the relevance of my experience to the reader. These 2 sentences that I've added essentially say, life might be giving you signs, but only if you're looking out for them. That's what I learnt in my experience, and if you can take away that lesson from that experience, awesome. Don't forget, we've also got this additional element of adding white space into our reviewed versions of the response. The original version was a mess. Anyone would look at it on a screen and think, no thanks. The reviewed version, on the other hand, is much more inviting. The content's broken up into small, bite-sized chunks that are more accessible to the reader. The visual difference between the original version and the reviewed version illustrates the power of using white space. Some feedback regarding this whole discussion of applying the writing concisely principle to that section. Ensure every sentence develops the entire main idea, not just one aspect of it. Let's move on and talk about how to apply the structure principle. Our task is to cross-reference the structure of a blog post with your color-coded paragraphs to determine whether you've accidentally omitted any elements. What does that mean? Well, let's say I go through the following process in applying the structure principle to a color-coded and modified version of section 4, i.e. main idea number 3, from example 1. Our first step in doing all of that is to revise the structure of step 4 of a blog post. Then we cross-reference that structure with the color-coded version of section 4. As we can see, almost all of the subsections are included. The heading is there, but the idea subsection isn't. So in step 3, we'd annotate the section to include the omitted subsection. For this example, I didn't write the idea subsection, so I'd write it and annotate it into the original version to make it the reviewed version. This is now a very clear visual reminder of what you should be focusing on the next time you tackle a response like this. Some feedback in relation to what we've just discussed about structure. Don't forget to include the subsection after the heading. It should elaborate on the content of the heading and briefly hint at what's to come in the example subsection. That's our discussion of the structure principle. Now let's discuss one overarching point of feedback. Same process that we went through in relation to persuasive texts. For writing concisely, we ensure every sentence develops the main idea, not just one aspect of it. For structure, don't forget to include the idea subsection after the heading. It should elaborate on the content of the heading and briefly hint at what's to come in the example subsection. So, bearing those individual points of feedback in mind, I could come up with the following overarching point. Use the idea subsection to concisely hint at what's to come and don't write anything that doesn't relate to the entire main idea. That's how you review an interpretive text. Essentially, it's the same process that you go through in reviewing a persuasive text. Nice and easy. Final main part of this lesson, and then we're done. Let's talk about reviewing example 2 from the lessons on imaginative texts. Our question: create an imaginative text with a central voice that conveys hope or redemption. Relevant steps of the planning steps. Kindly pause the video and have a read. Let's talk about how to apply the imagery, punctuation, and paragraphing principle. Reviewing an imaginative text is slightly different because it has this principle instead of the writing concisely principle. In light of that difference, we've got a slightly different key. In fact, a very different key. So bear these things in mind as we take a look at the edits of these original and reviewed versions. Imagery will be underlined, punctuation will be blue and bold, paragraphing will be indicated with a line break in green or a paragraph break in green. That's the key for the original version. For the reviewed version, we've got the following. Edited info is in purple. A line or paragraph break is this little symbol. Here's a modified version of the climax section of Simon Says. I've deliberately included a few things we can correct. This is the reviewed version. Please pause the video and read each one, starting with the original. Let's discuss some of the main changes made. Firstly, regarding imagery. Original version, reviewed version. The reviewed version makes the reader visualize, specifically using visual imagery and tactile imagery, how crammed the hut must be for Charlie for him to not even be able to turn his head. A comment to do with punctuation. Original version, 129 asks again. We're taking a look at these words in relation to punctuation because they're a dialogue tag. The reviewed version is simply, without the dialogue tag. So why did we take out the dialogue tag for the reviewed version? Because it's already evident that 129 was speaking. Next up, an example or two about paragraphing. The original version, notice how there are minimal line breaks and paragraph breaks, and compare this to the reviewed version. This first line break is used to indicate a shift in a topic. This is a minor shift in topic, whereas a paragraph break is used to indicate a major shift in topic. If this doesn't really make sense, pause the video and have a read about why the line break might only be a minor shift, and then the paragraph break being a better example of a major shift. So that is an application of the imagery, punctuation, paragraphing principle. Main point of feedback in relation to that: use different types of imagery to give the reader a complete sensory experience. It's so easy to just associate this idea or this concept of imagery in English to be limited to visual imagery, but we've since learnt that we are multi-sensory beings and we should try and exploit that when we're writing. Finally, let's talk about how to apply the structure principle to imaginative texts. Our task is to use the checklist that I know you've completed after lessons on the exposition, the background, rising action, and climax, and the resolution to determine whether you've accidentally omitted or missed out any aspects. So let's say I go through the following process in applying the structure principle to the background section of the short story from example 2. Simon Says. This is the relevant checklist for the background section. I'd inspect the checklist of the section that I'm reviewing, which is the background, and I would see that I've actually done a cross in relation to one question. Apparently, I answered no in relation to the question, does the nature of the conflict contextualize the exposition? So that's step one. Then in step two, I would cross-reference the checklist with the background section of the short story. When I answered no in relation to this question, I was really saying the background didn't tell the reader enough about what happened in the exposition section, the section before the background, and therefore missed an essential ingredient of a great story. Main point being that after reading the background, I wanted the reader to know that Charlie, the protagonist, is in Auschwitz. By telling the reader that, I would be contextualizing the exposition. When I was reviewing this section, I realized that's something I should do. So this is what I wrote while applying this step of the structure principle. Ultimately, I did this so I can tick that box on the relevant checklist. Because as we know, once we've got all of those essential ingredients, we're hitting all the main things a waste marker wants to see in your response. So that's our application of the structure principle. Here is a feedback point in relation to it. Don't assume the reader knows a critical aspect of your plot if you haven't communicated it. That original version we looked at didn't communicate a critical aspect of my plot, being that Charlie is at Auschwitz. That setting alone evokes all of these intense emotions. I wanted the reader to feel those. One final time, let's come up with one overarching point of feedback. This process begins by revisiting the feedback from each review in relation to the imagery, punctuation, and paragraphing hat. Use different types of imagery to give the reader a complete sensory experience. In relation to the structure hat, don't assume the reader knows a critical aspect of your plot if you haven't communicated that aspect. From these 2 points, I've come up with the following one overarching point of feedback that I will bear in mind whenever I go and write my next imaginative text. Immerse the reader in a complete sensory experience, especially when conveying critical aspects of the plot. That's all the main content for the lesson. Let's do our last simple summary together of Module 5. I'll miss this red shirt. First part of this lesson, we discussed why it is essential to review your practice responses. Basically, reviewing your practice writing will improve your exam writing. Failing to review your practice responses is like baking cookies and not eating any. It's a waste. Once we got that stuff out of the way, we then looked at the guiding principles for reviewing text types. Starting with the writing concisely principle. We looked at this in Module 3 and Module 4. If you're writing concisely, it means you're addressing each part of the question in a few words and with no ambiguity. Addressing each part of the question means you're being comprehensive. Using a few words means you're being brief. If a sentence, phrase, or word doesn't add value to your response, delete it. Adding value to your response means writing something related to the question and your thesis or main idea. That's the brevity element. The final element refers to the words no ambiguity in the definition, and that refers to being clear. Ask yourself, can I rewrite a given sentence, phrase, or word more clearly? Then we had a look at the imagery, punctuation, and paragraphing principle. This refers to ensuring your short story employs imagery, proper punctuation, and appropriate paragraphing. Regarding imagery, a key tip here is show, don't tell by using imagery. Then we recapped a few tips and tricks regarding proper punctuation. Tip 1, keep dialogue punctuation inside quotation marks. Tip 2, use ellipses to indicate that a character's words are trailing off. Tip 3, use dashes to indicate that a character's words are being cut off. Tip 4, use commas to punctuate dialogue tags except when the dialogue trails off, is exclamatory or interrogative. Tip 5, use full stops to punctuate action tags, use a comma when using an action tag and a dialogue tag. Tip 6, always start a section of dialogue with a capital letter, use lowercase to continue dialogue interrupted by a tag. Final element of this principle, appropriate paragraphing. The tip is start a new paragraph or line when you change time or location, start a new topic, or shift speakers. Last but not least, we discussed the structure principle. By following this principle, you are ensuring your text incorporates all the elements of a persuasive speech, blog post, or short story taught in EAMS. Check out the comparison table in the PDF study notes for an overview of the different elements of these different text types. Then we moved on to looking at example 1 from the lesson on persuasive text and example 1 from the lesson on interpretive texts. These two text types have the same two review principles, and here are some things we learned when we were applying the writing concisely principle. When you're reviewing a persuasive text or interpretive text, look out for opportunities to, firstly, identify unnecessary repetition. Secondly, delete text. Thirdly, rearrange syntax. Fourthly, reword ambiguous words or phrases. Fifthly, move sentences. After that, we spoke about applying the structure principle. Step 1, revise the structure of the paragraph or section you're reviewing. Step 2, cross-reference the structure with the color-coded paragraph or section. Step 3, annotate the paragraph or section to include any omitted elements. We then had a look at one overarching point of feedback for each text type. How is that relevant for you? I want you to remember the following. For each text, use the feedback you've developed from each review hat to create one overarching point of feedback. Those are the most important things I want you to remember regarding example 1 for persuasive texts and interpretive texts. Let's finish off this lesson by looking at the main things from our discussion of example 2 in relation to imaginative texts. First up, how to apply the imagery, punctuation, and paragraphing principle. When you're reviewing an imaginative text, look out for opportunities to incorporate different types of sensory imagery, incorporate proper punctuation, or incorporate appropriate paragraphing. Then we discussed how to apply the structure principle. First step, inspect the checklist of the section you're reviewing. Second step, cross-reference the checklist with the section. Third step, annotate the section to include any omitted elements so you can ultimately answer yes to every question on the checklist. Last thing we did was look at one overarching point of feedback in relation to this imaginative text. Same point applies. Make sure you collate all of that feedback you've given to yourself into one thing that you can remember to apply and bear in mind the next time you go and write that section. Just like that, finish the last video lesson for this module. We made it. If you've made it this far, you've already worked so hard to get to the end of module 5. In order to truly complete it, you just got to do the activities for this lesson. That is the ultimate box you want to tick, at least for now. So have fun seeing where you can improve with your creative writing. That's all it is. Don't overthink it. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for hanging out with me in this module. I'll see you in the next and last module of English ATAR Made Simple. Wearing my favorite color, might I add. Until then, keep it simple. Because, trust me, these hats are cooler than sunglasses in a thunderstorm. You want to bet?